So there isn't much to celebrate on this Labor Day this year, right? Given the shutdowns, the impact from the economic downturn. So in general, I think the workers all the world over, face more sufferings than they have already have.
Absolutely right, Kuntep Chai. And so it's just my honor and privilege. While we can't get out on the streets, we can raise our voices from wherever we are. And it's a privilege to be able to highlight the fact that while workers have made advances for many years, migrant workers especially are under a particular strain and stress during this COVID-19 response.
So what's the difficulty you got report from migrant laborers? Can you just give us some examples?
The lockdown situations, while it definitely in the best interests of the full society, and of course we're in full support, but we just have to recognize that the lockdown actually makes some people more unsafe. And so some examples of that would be people who are domestic workers. Many domestic workers have been working longer hours during this time, and actually many have experienced withholding of pay, lower pay. We know that there are many workers who are forced to go to work but with inadequate protections, leaving some situations of outbreaks in migrant worker communities. We can think of the or we can think of the Singapore situation. Of course, we also know migrant workers just as well as anybody else. Some of them face situations of domestic violence and abuse, and I think we should always recognize in this situation that people facing particularly gender-based violence at home are under extreme risk, higher risk at this time.
But do you think authorities in countries, at least countries in this region, are paying attention to the plight of the workers as you have just outlined?
I'm so happy to see in Thailand that we have some really good measures the past few days, including even just today the release of a hotline for migrant workers to be able to 1422 to be able to call in and voice their own concerns, and even have response in different languages available to migrant workers, especially Myanmar, Cambodia, and Lao PDR. So that's really progressive, and we know that the governments have been trying to get more registration of migrant workers so that there's better access to medical care, and to make there have been made some exceptions to the need to do immigration office visits to be able to extend visas. So we definitely appreciate that. We know there's been a lot of concern, especially since the Singapore second outbreak was really focused in the housing facilities where migrant workers were living. And so I think that was really a wake-up call that governments in the region need to pay attention to not only the factories, but maybe even more so the living conditions and living facilities of places where the migrant workers have been at. But we want to highlight the fact that migrant workers continue to be at risk for forced labor, and even more so during these times.
Yeah.
And what is mechanism by IJM in order to help those migrant workers or domestic workers who are facing even more difficulty during this lockdown?
Yeah, thank you. So IJM's plan is to work together with governments and support governments. We know governments have the rightful role and duty under the laws in each country here in the ASEAN region. Strong laws for worker protection do exist, and so our goal is to help governments in seeing the consistent and regular enforcement of those laws so that workers can really be fully protected. That would include good labor inspections, good police investigations in case of any cases found where there may be problems, good worker protections through any of those processes, safe and fair return to home where workers can and want to do that.
As you know, that the population of migrant workers in Thailand is quite huge, and not much different from what happens in Singapore. They cram into dormitories or houses, living quarters. And of course, there has been question raised about the level or extent of testing for coronavirus among these migrant workers. Do you have any observation on that?
Well, I think testing is a limitation all over the world, and testing is something that all countries are looking to ramp up. I do think that when we're not testing, we're definitely leaving ourselves vulnerable to transmission that will only later be found out. So we would definitely point to the need to continue to increase testing, particularly in migrant communities. And I think the thing to point out about migrant communities is that although the government has been trying to get the word out that they don't have anything to fear from getting medical testing or support, but in fact there's a widespread and deeply held belief in migrant communities all around the region that if they do come forward to authorities that they might find themselves being detained somehow or deported. There's a great fear of coming in touch with government officials from many migrant communities. And so that's why we really advocate for more testing to be done in migrant communities and in collaboration with those migrant communities so that there can be increased trust and not fear.
Are these migrant labor the first group to be left behind in this lockdown situation? How do you see it? Because right now we can see clearly economic impact happening in many countries around the world, Thailand, Singapore, and local people tend to get assistance. But what about migrant labor?
Well, it is going to be a reality that migrant laborers are going to feel the pinch most acutely. I think for sure the economic stimulus measures and the economic enhancement policies in all of the countries in the region are going to focus on citizens. As arguably, that's something that I think would have widespread public support. And yet the economies of these countries have been built on large part of migrant labor support in the past couple of decades. And so we would want to see that governments and businesses would take care of those migrant workers who have helped them build the businesses. And I would say that law enforcement officials should be extra vigilant at this time to watch out for any who would cut corners and abuse the most vulnerable workers among us.
There is one aspect of the shutdowns that few people in Thailand have talked about. Even shutdowns in many countries mean that more children will be spending more time at home, right? Of course, the children don't mind, they're more than happy about that. But that means that they would be spending more time online and thus exposing themselves to people with criminal minds who want to prey on them for whatever reason. Trafficking or sexual abuses. I'm sure that IJM has a lot of concern about this issue.
A huge concern, Kuntepchai, and so we absolutely know and actually are seeing increased rates of people preying on children for online sexual exploitation during this season. And it's absolutely incumbent on authorities to consider the protection of the most vulnerable to be one of the priorities or one of the parts of the COVID response. Certainly we all agree with and understand the need for frontliners and the public health community to be highly prioritized, but I would also think that protection of the most vulnerable sectors that can be preyed on during this time is also very much an issue. And I do think in Thailand there are children at risk online because there are those who are willing to prey on them and they will take advantage of the opportunity.
That's the view from International Justice Mission on the plight of ASEAN labor during lockdown in COVID-19 situation.